Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Budget Magic. So last week I was thinking about what we should build for Budget Magic this week, and I remembered Combustible Gearhulk. And Combustible Gearhulk, why it wasn't at the top of my Gearhulk rankings, it feels like a card that can be really powerful in the right build. Also, because it hasn't been super heavily played so far, it's kind of getting cheap. Cheap enough that we can actually build around it for Budget Magic. So I tried to set out to build the best Combustible Gearhulk deck possible, and we ended up with a super sweet Combustible Ramp deck. As you can see, $89 in the paper world, 39 takes on Magic Online, a pretty good price for a sweet deck for Kaladesh Standard. A quick reminder before we get to the deck, if you enjoy Budget Magic and you enjoy this Combustible Ramp deck, it would be awesome of you if you could take a quick second, click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So let's talk Combustible Ramp. So first off, Combustible Gearhulk, the namesake card. It is super huge, 6 mana, 6/6 first strike, so it is devastating in combat. It dodges a lot of removal. Grasp of Darkness, for example, isn't going to be able to hit it because it's just too big. And then it has an Enter the Battlefield trigger, which looks bad because it gives your opponent a lot of choice. It's essentially what we call a Punisher card, where your card does something, but it gives your opponent the choice, which means your opponent's always going to choose whatever's better for them, which often makes these cards worse than they look. So with Combustible Gearhulk, the Punisher trigger is either your opponent lets you draw 3 cards, which is sweet. Drawing cards is usually pretty powerful. 3 is a pretty big number attached to a 6/6. Or they make you mill 3 cards and take damage equal to the total converted mana cost of cards that are milled. So if they mill an Emrakul the Promised End, that's 13 damage. That's a lot of damage. If they mill an Emrakul and a 2-drop, that's 15 damage, and so forth. It all adds together. So the idea of this deck was to take away the choice from the opponent. So make it so that no matter what our opponent chooses, it's going to be really good for us. So how do we go about breaking Combustible Gearhulk and making this deck? Well, first off, we need big expensive things to make the choice of taking damage risky. But we also need those things to be castable. We can't just play a whole bunch of 10 drops because 10 is a lot of mana. It's going to make our deck too clunky. So what I realized is there's some cards in Standard that have really high converted mana costs, but actually aren't as expensive as they look because of their mechanics. So we have 4 Decimator of Province, which is 10 mana as far as Combustible Gearhulk is concerned. So the dream scenario is we cast a Gearhulk, our opponent's like, alright, mill the cards I don't want you to draw. We flip over 2 Decimator of the Provinces and just 20 our opponent, game over on the spot. So that's kind of the magical Christmas Land scenario. It's also just sort of like a Craterhoof Behemoth. 7/7 gives all of our team +2/+2 and trample when it enters the turn, plus it has trample and haste. So if you have a bunch of creatures around, this is another way we just close out the game with Decimator, and it has a merge for 6 and 3 green. So if we sack something when we cast it, we can make it cost a lot cheaper. So one of the neat synergies of this is Combustible Gearhulk just so happens to be 6 mana. So when we cast Combustible Gearhulk, if our opponent chooses to mill our cards and they mill a Decimator of Provinces, they're at least taking 10 damage. On the other hand, if they choose to give us the cards, we get the Decimator, we can sack the Combustible Gearhulk, pay just 3 green mana, get a 7/7 trample haste that tramples up the rest of our team and wins the game. Bedlam Reveler is mostly there because, for one thing, it improves our hand by allowing us to discard our hand and draw 3 cards when it enters the battlefield. It costs 8 mana, so it's a lot of damage when we hit it off a Combustible Gearhulk. Decimator plus Bedlam Reveler together is 18 damage, almost enough to just kill our opponent. Plus, we have a few instants and sorceries, so even though it costs 8 mana, it's not really going to cost us 8 mana when we cast it. Maybe it'll be 6 mana or 5 mana, because we have a Fiery Impulse or Harness Lightnings, those type of cards in our graveyard. So, step 1 is Combustible Gearhulk. Step 2 is big things that have huge converted mana costs, but actually aren't that expensive to cast. And then we just got to ramp into these things as quickly as possible. So Standard is a fairly fast place. It's fast enough that we don't just want to try to cast Combustible Gearhulk on turn 6. Plus, if we're going to be playing Decimator of Provinces, we want to have creatures around to get the benefit of everything gets +2/+2 and trample. So we have 8 2-mana mana dorks, 4 Deathcap Cultivators, and 4 Servant of the Conduits. These just let us jump the curve from turn 2. We play one of these on turn 3. We're going to have access to 4 mana, and that leads us to even more ramping. So we have 4 Wild Wanderers. So hopefully on turn 3, if we have the mana dork, we're playing a Wild Wanderer, which allows us to search a land out of our deck when it enters the battlefield, put it onto the battlefield, and 4 Hedron Archive, which ramps for 2, plus we can sack it to draw cards if we run out of action. So on turn 2, we play our Deathcap Cultivator, and then on turn 3, we play Hedron Archive or Wild Wanderer. That means when we tap on turn 4, we have access to at least 6 mana, which means it's Combustible Gearhulk time, and then we're either dealing a ton of damage to our opponent or drawing all those cards, which hopefully finds us Decimators and Bedlam Revelers and all that other stuff. So that's the basic idea of the deck, is we are really just a green-red ramp deck that's using Combustible Gearhulk as the big payoff card in conjunction with Bedlam Reveler and with our Decimator of the Provinces. As far as the rest of the main deck, a couple of Tireless Tracker. Just for value, we were missing something on the 3-drop slot in our curve, and Tireless Tracker is a really good one. It works well with the Wild Wander. Oh, speaking of Wild Wander, I forgot to mention this. It's also a really good emerge target if we aren't sacking our Combustible Gearhulk to Decimator. Wild Wander on turn 4, it's 4 mana. Decimator is 5 mana. Extra to emerge because the emerge cost is 9. So technically on turn 5, we can sack a Wild Wanderer to our Decimator Provinces and just get in with our huge Decimator, trample up whatever 2-drops we have sitting around. So Tireless Tracker is just for value, makes us some clues, lets us cycle through our deck, and then Harness Lightning and Fire Your Temper, kill Smuggler's Copters, kill lots of early game creatures, opposing Tireless Trackers and Sylvan Advocates, and all this stuff from Red-White Vehicles and Grim Flayers. Just really good instant speed removal, plus they fill the graveyard with instants to reduce the cost on our Bedlam Reveler. In the mana base, pretty straightforward. A bunch of blue-red duals, including some Evolving Wilds. A bunch of basic lands, including 1 Plains, which is part of our sideboard plan. We'll talk about that in a second. And then a Handweir Battlement, which is nice. It can give our Combustible Gearhulk haste, let us get in that damage out of nowhere. And just a Blighted Woodland is like a backup ram spell. I figured our mana was good enough. We could afford a couple colorless lands, and these are reasonable ones. In the sideboard, Weaver of Lightning for aggro, Radiant Flames also for aggro, and that's why we're playing the single Plains. We can search it up with our Wild Wanderer, and that lets us Radiant Flames X3 instead of X2, and that hits like DePaula, which X2 wouldn't hit. A Commencement of Festivities, a little weird, a fog effect, mostly to fight against green-red energy. It's a way you can kind of 3 or 4 for 1 them. If they're throwing a bunch of pump spells at Electrostatic Pummeler, 2 mana, you just fizzle the entire attack, all those pump spells are gone. Then we have a bunch of removal for artifacts and enchantments. Most interestingly, Mockery of Nature, another card that's really expensive for our Combustible Gearhulk, but not that expensive because it also has Emerge. And then a Takedown to deal with Avacins and other flyers, and then Tireless Tracker and a Mina and Den Wildborn, which is actually pretty sweet as a kind of a combo. So Tireless Tracker gets us clue when lands enter the battlefield. Mina and Den, a 4/4 for 4, so pretty big. Plus it lets us play an additional land each turn, which means additional clue each turn. And that is Combustible Ramp for Kaladesh Standard. And I think this deck is pretty sweet. So it is, I mean, it is what it is. It's pretty straightforward. We are all focused on one game plan, and that is on turns 2, 3, and sometimes 4, we are really just planning on ramping, occasionally killing something if we have to, but we're pretty much just looking to ramp and get a bunch of mana. So hopefully our opening hand will have multiple ramp cards, and then at least 1 or 2 payoff cards, like Combustible Gearhulk, Bedlam Reveler. And then, once we get the mana going, we Combustible Gearhulk can either kill our opponent or draw some more cards, and if we draw more cards, cards that gets us to our Decimators and our Bedlam Revelers, so it really chains together nicely. I also really like that for a green-red deck, we have a lot of card advantage. Tireless Tracker generates card advantage. Combustible Gearhulk often generates card advantage. Hedron Archive, we can turn into a 6-mana colorless divination if we have to. And when we ramp so much, we can sometimes just do that. We have a bunch of mana, so paying to sacrifice a Hedron Archive isn't a huge cost, gets us some more cards. And then Bedlam Reveler is also really nice. We have some hands where we're just like ramp spell, ramp spell, ramp spell, Death Cap, and Servant of the Conduit, and Wild Wanderer, and that uses up most of our hand. Then we just cast the Bedlam Reveler, and it sort of refills our hand, plus gives us a reasonable body. So I think it's pretty sweet. It's definitely fairly linear and straightforward, but it is just very powerful. Our cards are just more powerful than our opponent's cards in a lot of situations, and I really think that Decimator of the Provinces and Combustible Gearhulk are just two very underrated cards. Those cards are very powerful and essentially completely unplayed in Standard, so I'm excited to try to take advantage of some of those cards, and I don't know, I think this deck can definitely compete. It is pretty focused, but I think it has what it takes to compete just because the power level of some of the payoff cards is really high, plus having 8 instant speed answers to Smuggler's Copters and Harness Lightning and Fiery Temper, really beneficial. So anyway, that's been our deck tech for Combustible Ramp in Kaladesh Standard. I hope you enjoy the gameplay videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you soon.